Hello, everyone. Welcome to Due Process. This is Trevor Wadden. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with award-winning professor of psychology, Will Huggon. Will and I will be discussing several topics, including deception detection and juries. By way of introduction, Will holds a PhD and a master's degree in psychology. He is a sessional lecturer at the University of Toronto, where he teaches courses in the fields of social psychology and forensic psychology. Will is dedicated to higher education and has numerous awards related to his devoted style of teaching. Will, we were talking about how busy you are off air, and we certainly appreciate your making time for us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to cover some topics that generally fall under the umbrella of forensic psychology during our discussion today. If we could just start with forensic psychology as a discipline. Could you give us a bit of a definition of how that differs from traditional psychology?
Yeah, sure. So the definition of forensics in general, so more of a simple definition is the use of science in law, or the use of scientific methods to help or assist in investigation of crime or in a legal setting. So if you say forensic psychology, that would be the use of psychology in law. So from regular psychology, I mean, it's the exact same thing. It's just focused on use in the criminal justice system. And you can take a look at, doing research. So psychology and the law. So that's kind of what I do. And then also psychology in the law, where you use things that we've discovered in our psychological research and apply it to law. So fitness to stand trial assessments were created by psychologists, or, challenge for cause process would be definitely developed or with psychologists, things along those lines, where it's this use of the research that we've done that relates to crime and law, and hopefully it can be of some benefit.
Gotcha. And is this, Will, is just out of curiosity, is this an area that you were always interested in?
Yes, I actually, in my undergrad, was not a psych major in my first year, and I took a psychology class. It didn't actually have any forensic content in it, but I was also reading about profilers, FBI profilers, and I actually ended up changing schools, changing majors because I was so interested in it, and it's kind of been my course ever since.
And something that we might get into a little bit later when we discuss juries and some of the social science evidence out there. There seems to be a little bit of reluctance in our court system to introduce certain types of expert evidence. In your experience, have you noticed there's that reluctance with our justice system in terms of listening to forensic psychologists?
Yeah, it kind of stems from, the 60s and 70s, when, psychology was kind of more of I mean, we've been around for, 100 plus years, but being thought of as more of a hard science is not necessarily always the case when it comes to psychology. And we started realizing that a lot of the stuff that we were testing in labs wasn't really real in real life. So we started focusing a lot more on the scientific method and went really far into behaviorism. So stimulus response, and then started moving more into, what's going on in the mind, and aggregate scores to find things that could actually predict or have probabilities of happening in real life. And I think, in the 70s, it was a lack of trust between police organizations and academia, where academia was kind of full of themselves, and the police were actually in the field doing this stuff. So, what would really the other have to offer? And as we've started working together a lot more, I think both sides have come to realize that, we have a lot to offer each other. But this is still potentially, there's a pushback on it, because to have an expert witness from any field, including psychology, come into a court trial in Canada or in the United States, they have to have something to offer to the juries or the jurors in as education. And it has to be something that they don't have a normal education about. So usually what happens is it's a bias or misconception that jurors have, and it's very, very common. And even judges might have the same common misconception, because we're all somewhat raised in the same culture: TV, social media, movies, whatever, our parents, previous generations. So what happens is we all kind of believe, oh, this is the truth. And it's not. And the research shows that it's actually, happens in a different way. And that's when we really need experts to come in and talk about it in court trials. And, there is a little bit of pushback, because we have to meet certain standards, the Mohan and Dobert standards, depending on if you're in Canada versus the United States. And it basically is, are you actually an expert? Is this backed up by research that you've done? Is this backed up by your peers? Is this backed up by publication? And that all has to go through the judge first before we're allowed in. And there has to be an air of reality that the juries actually even need it. So you have to kind of jump through a bunch of hurdles. But a lot of the time, if it has been allowed before, then precedence states that we would be allowed in. The judge would probably allow it.
In Canada, you have the Moen criteria that you mentioned, where there has to be relevant and necessary for an expert. There's the idea that it has to be, like you said, you have to add educative component of it, where you're giving the trier of fact, whether that's the judge or jury, something beyond common experience, I guess, is, I think, the words the court uses. Do you think part of the reluctance in admitting forensic psychology, social science evidence related to, memory and deception detection is because everyone feels like they are already aware of the information just through experience as a human?
Yeah. So we're aware of, how our memory works as a human. We're aware of how, we can tell if our loved ones or friends are lying to us, things along those lines. The problem is that if I kind of lean a little bit more on, attitude psychology or social psychology, we fill in the blanks when we're in a situation that's unusual. So we ask ourselves a question: could this situation be plausible? And usually what happens in those situations is that we go, okay, well, what is my experience in this? And you lean on your experience. Depending on how old you are, you could have 10, 20, 30 years of experience where you've been rewarded when it works and you've been punished when it didn't work. So we kind of automatically do things very, very well. Works 9 times out of 10, something. I'm just making up that number, but it works quite a bit. But when it comes to a situation that's unusual or that we don't have very much experience with, instead of backing away from it, we say, okay, well, what's the next closest thing in our brain? Okay. So for memory, like studying for a test or, your first kiss or that conversation you had, all right, we've got really good memory for that. And research actually shows that our memory isn't like a video recorder. In the best circumstances where we set up an experiment where we've got some kind of manipulation to make memory worse. And we always have a control condition where everything's perfect, where memory should be perfect. Even in the control condition, we always find that the people only have about 80% memory for what happened, which is amazing, but it's nowhere close to 100. So what happens is that we kind of lean on this. So say we witness a bank robbery. When was the last time anyone actually witnessed a bank robbery? Never. I never have. And how long did it take? It took 2 seconds, 10 seconds, a couple minutes, depending on, the situation. So we go, oh, what did I see? And on top of that, let's just say what we're going to draw on from our common experience. So when we say, hey, is this plausible that, this guy was wearing dark clothes or was had a gun or whatever, we draw on the information that we're familiar with. And because we aren't actually familiar with this, we draw upon books and TV shows and movies and things along those lines. And then we also kind of lean on people around us because I don't have the information. So maybe the people around me who are also witnesses have this information. So you can see a situation like that where you glimpsed a gunman for a minute or something like that. And you're also, on top of all of that, you're in a fight or flight situation. So you're in really high stress. Whenever we're in a fight or flight situation, our memory it just kind of shuts off. Our digestive system shuts off, our memory shuts off, and we want to run away. We've kind of got tunnel vision. So then later on, when we're sitting trying to remember what happened, we go, okay, well, my memory always worked before. I've never been in a situation like that before. So I wouldn't even consider that I wouldn't have the same memory that I normally would have. And then if anything is introduced, so perfect situation would be that witness sat by themselves, didn't talk to anyone until the police talked to them. But most likely they sat and chatted with someone else. What happens when you're in a situation where, you think you might die, you're going to go get comfort by talking to other people. Oh, I saw the guy, but I didn't really get a good look. He was wearing all dark clothes. And the person says, oh yeah, I noticed it was kind of weird. He was wearing all dark clothes, but he had that dark green hat on. And you ask yourself, well, I didn't see the dark green hat, but is that plausible? Well, what am I familiar with? Well, on TV shows, they wear dark clothes. I mean, they could wear a green hat. Yeah, okay, it was a green. This guy saw it. So yeah. And now it's integrated into your memory and you're 100% sure that he was wearing a green hat and, maybe both people are wrong and they were wearing a black hat or a blue hat. Now, on the other hand, if it's not plausible, so doesn't go along with what you're familiar with from, the stereotypes of, a gunman is like, oh, it was really weird that he was wearing a pink hat with purple polka dots. That's not within, your realm, your stereotype of what a gunman looks like. They're tall, wearing all black. Maybe they got a mask over their head. They've got a gun. They, yell, everyone put their hands up, or everyone get down the ground. Maybe they've got a bag with a dollar sign on it if you've watched a lot of cartoons. And so when the person says purple hat with pink polka dots, you go, no, that's not plausible. And that doesn't get integrated into your memory. But the problem is that a lot of things are pretty plausible, and now you remember it, and now you've got this false memory about it. So what hopefully what a witness would do or an expert witness would do when they come in is educate the jurors that, hey, and they wouldn't try to discredit this eyewitness. That's up to the juries or the judge. Their job is to judge the evidence and make a verdict. So what the expert would do is come in and say, hey, in this situation, these variables were at play. They were sitting and talking to another witness. Maybe there were some leading questions accidentally by the police. Maybe they practiced that over and over again the 4 months leading up to the trial. So now they're really, really confident. And now let's go into the research, forensic psychology research on eyewitness testimony and what happens when they're more confident versus less confident. Let's go into the research on when they've sat with another witness. Let's go into the research when there's a misleading comment by the police. Again, not necessarily in a malicious way or anything like that, just natural conversation when you're asking someone, did you see the gun? They should have maybe said, did you see what happened? Or were they holding anything? Or even, are they holding anything? Now the person's saying, oh, were they holding something? What you want to do is educate those jurors to go, okay, well, those things can alter memory. These variables were at play in this specific trial. And then now they want to see, well, does the testimony still fit in with the rest of the evidence? And hopefully what happens is that it makes them a little less biased in thinking that the eyewitness testimony must be infallible. So now maybe they're taking it with a little bit more of a grain of salt. They may still find the person guilty, but at least it's more of a fair trial.
And this idea, Will, of common sense, where there's lots of cases where judges, when they rule that an expert isn't needed, for let's just use the example of memory, for instance, is that this is a common sense. People are aware that memory isn't 100% accurate. So we can leave it to the judges, whether it's through their judicial instruction to the jury, or we can leave it to the lawyers in their closing or cross-examination to elicit this information and present it to the jury or the trier of fact. Do you think common sense is as common as courts like to think?
No, unfortunately. I mean, and think about what you just said too. It makes a lot of sense, right? Yes, memory is good, and memory normally is good in regular situations. And yes, if you ask jurors, maybe ask them before they became jury members, hey, do you think memory is 100%? They'd probably all say no. If you ask them, do you believe this eyewitness who is, I'm 100% confident this is what I saw? That's actually a huge factor in accuracy. So confidence is not correlated very well with accuracy at all. It's like a tiny, tiny percentage. So the more confident you are doesn't make you more accurate, and the more accurate you are doesn't make you more confident. You could have amazing memory and not be confident about it at all, or you could have amazing memory and be super confident about it, or you could have no memory at all and be, I'm 100% sure this happened. But that confidence does affect juries and does affect judges. If someone says I'm 100% confident, you're going to believe them, and that person's going to be going to prison, because confidence really does affect juries. It's a big factor. And then we can also look at, there's this common sense idea that, oh, memory's not that bad. But when we look at all of the people who have been exonerated over the years, we find out later on that there was a witness that knows that they were 300 kilometers away at the time, or there's DNA evidence that says that they didn't do it or whatever. About 75% of the time, as shown by the Innocence Project in Canada and in the States, it's because there was faulty eyewitness testimony that said, that's the guy who did it, I'm sure. And it's very, very, credible sounding, but at the same time, it's false memory. It isn't actually accurate.
Well, I want to turn now to not memory, but another area that people have a lot of confidence in, which is their ability to detect when someone is lying to them, deception detection. And I have anecdotally experienced this with some friends and even some family members where they believe intuitively that they think they can spot a liar. Will, generally, are people as good as they think they are at detecting liars?
Research has consistently shown, like decades of research, that people's ability to detect lies with strangers is actually only about as accurate as chance. So around 50 to 54% accurate. So if you were to really sit down and try to tell if someone was telling a lie and then made your choice, or if I took a quarter and flipped it and did it that way, I'd be about as accurate as that person. And this holds across all the research. So students, psychologists, judges, people are giving job interviews, law enforcement personnel. There is some research that shows that the Secret Service are closer to 60% accurate, which means that's a little bit better. But this is in a meta-analysis of Personality and Social Psychology Review. I don't know, about 15 years ago, one came out. I'm sure there's more recent now, but that's the one that pops into my head. Now, on the other hand, I did say people's ability to detect lies with strangers is about chance. But the reason why we think that we're so good at being able to see if someone can tell a lie or not, and why we're really, really kind of overconfident about it, is that we are not bad. We're much better than chance when it comes to people we know. And the thing is that we have a baseline of behavior. I've known this person for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And now I can compare that to when they usually tell the truth, or in the past when I didn't know they were lying, but then they admitted that they were lying after the fact. And now I can think back to how they were acting, like, oh, yeah, they had a tell or whatever. So because we think we know what the average liar looks like from experience with actual liars, we're very, very confidently getting it wrong with strangers.
The myth that we are good at detecting when someone is lying to us, why do you think that continues to endure?
Well, because again, there is this kind of thing that where we fall back on what we're familiar with, and we usually aren't trying to tell if a stranger is lying to us, right? We're usually trying to tell if, a loved one or a friend or at least an acquaintance is lying to us. So when we're in a situation with a stranger, we fall back on, the cues from, the people we know. On top of that, we're kind of trained socially from a very young age to don't lie. So we just assume if I'm not going to lie, then a stranger's not going to lie. And what's really, in reality, the strangers that you would meet up with are probably not criminal strangers. They're regular strangers. So if you walk up to someone on the street and say, "Hey, do you know the way to get to wherever you're going, CN Tower, say in Toronto?" They'd probably say, "Oh, you go down this road and you turn there." What would be the point of them lying, right? And so we usually think, oh well, strangers are the same as the regular people we know, and we can tell if they're lying or not. So we've been socialized to think that I don't lie, so no one else would lie. We do lie in certain situations, but we can tell really, quite well, maybe not 100%, but quite well with our loved ones. So then we again get into this unusual situation with a stranger. We're not really great at it. On top of that, we have all sorts of really fun TV shows where it's like a human lie detector, or movies or whatever. There was what was that TV show, Lie to Me, that was out for quite a while. And people are like, that's amazing. And you think that's what you fall back on. This is how it must work. So maybe I can do that too.
We're not going around trying to determine, or suspecting that everyone's lying to us, but there are situations where we are tasked with trying to figure out if they're being honest or credible with us. And there is an idea, or some people believe, that nonverbal cues, so someone's behaviorisms, for example, are a accurate way, or possibly an accurate way, to detect whether someone's being deceptive. Do you believe nonverbal cues are helpful to assess honesty?
No. And I'll tell you why. I mean, here's the thing. Deceptive people actually do have nonverbal cues. We find over and over again that liars who are in a situation where they're being accused of lying, they blush, they have gaze aversion, they have higher pitched voice, they have, less arm and leg movement, or maybe unusual arm or leg movement, which is kind of contradictory. Or maybe there's the old stuff where they look up and to the right or down to the left. So the problem is that that's somewhat true, and we find that with the people we know, when they're lying, they may do some of this stuff, but it's not the only thing, or it's not only liars do that, right? These are also situations where you're nervous. So I said blushing, gaze aversion, higher pitched voice. Imagine back to high school when you went up to that person you liked for the first time and you're blushing and you're not looking in the eye and you've got a higher pitched voice, is that you're lying to the person? No, it's that you're nervous. So there's an overlapping nonverbal cues with lying and nervousness, and we can't tease them out. So when we get into a situation where we're accusing someone of lying and we've got an innocent person and an actual liar, they'll actually display the same nonverbal cues.
This idea that these nonverbal cues is the idea that people, like you said, that liars they feel nervous when they're lying. I think is what some of the research does show, is that they do actually feel more nervous, but so do honest people in a stressful situation or whatever the circumstances may be. They're being grilled or questioned, they're shy or introverts or what have you.
Yeah, there's an assumption going into interviews with eyewitnesses that they are honest and telling the truth. And that assumption is now a bias that if I was to go in and interview someone would make me assume they're telling the truth, so I wouldn't necessarily question it as much. And I'm not saying that eyewitnesses are lying, but they could be, unfortunately, have false information that they think is the truth, and they're telling that to you. And then the other kind of assumption is that suspects in an interrogation or in the preliminary interview are liars and they're guilty. And the problem is that they might be innocent and they might be telling the truth. So if we go in with this kind of tunnel vision or investigator bias, we're going to be looking for these cues that we've potentially been taught. And what we find is that gaze aversion and higher pitched voice and not touching your chest, all these, nonverbal cues, they are very, very highly correlated, but with nervousness, not with lying. We just can't tease it out.
So given that we can't really differentiate between nervousness and deception or these nonverbal cues, do you have concerns that our justice system or our court system continues to instruct juries, for example, that they can consider the demeanor of a witness when assessing credibility and honesty? Now, I should, just to clarify, I'm not trying to be unfair to courts, because judges will say you can't be determinative. There's other factors you have to consider, but that still is being explained to jurors, that they can look at a witness's demeanor in assessing credibility.
Yeah, especially if, say, we've recorded an interrogation and we can see their demeanor. It's like, oh, they look so guilty, but actually they look so nervous. You can imagine we could have two types of people who are honest in an interview and two types of people who are guilty in an interview, those that are nervous and not. Okay. Now, I'm going to just make an assumption here and say that probably the majority of honest people are nervous. There may be a few that aren't that nervous, that, I just trust the justice system works. But again, from what we know, I mean, how often have you been interviewed by the police as an eyewitness? I usually poll my class and say, hey, how would you feel if you were an eyewitness to a crime and you had to go down to the police station and you had to, be interviewed by the police? And almost all of them say, oh, I'd be really nervous to do that. Like, what? Why would you be nervous? Well, because you're going down to the police station. I've never been there before. And on TV shows, it's always that innocent person that suddenly the police are yelling at and jumping across the table and banging on the table. So they might accuse me of something. And so imagine if you're actually a suspect and being accused of something and you're innocent, you're probably more likely than not to be innocent. But with criminals, depending on if this is their first time or if they're a career criminal, there's probably a likelihood that, at least compared to innocent people, there's going to be more of a majority of them. Maybe it's 50-50. Maybe it's still, a good chunk that are nervous, but there's probably a better chunk of them that are not nervous. And if we're looking for deceptive cues, but we're actually been trained to look for nervousness cues, then we may accuse innocent people of being guilty more often than we accuse guilty people of being guilty. And that's a huge problem, because we're basing this on demeanor. And if we've also been trained to look for these things, like specifically trained, it can actually make us even worse at it. There's a study by Casson and Fong where they looked at the Reed technique of deception detection, and they claimed that it's more than 80% accurate. So researchers went up to the Reed technique and say, well, can we look at the data? Can we look at, how you did this research? Like, no, it's proprietary information. So they're like, okay, well, can we get our hands on a manual? And they got their hands on a manual and they actually did the research. And what they did was they got a whole bunch of random people. They assigned them to two different groups. The one group was a control group where they didn't train them in deception detection at all. And the other group was trained specifically in the Reed technique of deception detection, which again looks at kind of the verbal and emotional leakage stuff and the nonverbal cues where like if you're deceptive, then you talk less and you don't look the person in the eye, and you've got okay, so they taught them all of these things which we all commonly know about already from books and TV and movies. And then once they were trained up, they got them to try to detect deception in random strangers. And on average, so when they took the average of the dozens of people that did this in the read technique group versus the control group, I already told you guys before that the control group, they're around 50% chance. I think they actually got about 54-55% accuracy. So again, it was pretty much chance. But the read technique group, who are actually experimentally trained to detect deception, their accuracy levels went down to 45% because they were more confident, because they were just taught all of these techniques that they would work. So they'd look for them. And these people who were innocent but nervous showed all of these cues. And the people said, oh, well, they must be guilty then. And this is one of the manuals that is being used all across North America, United States, Canada, to train people how to detect deception or train police services and security and all sorts of institutions in deception detection. And it doesn't work. They say it works. Maybe if we took out all the innocent people and we just interviewed guilty people, and we didn't tell the people doing the interviews, that everyone's guilty, and they had to try to pick out who was guilty and not, then maybe they're 80% accurate, which is actually a really bad indicator, because they should have said every one of them was, right?
And the read technique has been criticized, especially recently in Canada, but it's still being, like you said, it's still being offered. They still offer online courses, for example. Some police agencies, it appears, have modified it somewhat. But this is, I guess, it's fair to say it's a guilt presumptive style of interview. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're looking for these nonverbal cues, would that encourage tunnel vision?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if we were told beforehand to look for the truth, then I think we'd be trying to look for the truth. But if we're told beforehand that, and why, I mean, why would you even be interviewing this person unless they're a suspect? But that's the thing with suspects. We have to consider that they might be innocent. But if they're a suspect because the evidence has led down this trail to them, and you've also been taught in a style to look for quote unquote guiltiness, which is actually incorrect. We're looking for nervousness, and everyone's nervous, so it isn't actually a very accurate detection method anyway, then yeah, we're trying to get guilt. And when we're primed for these different cues and we see them, we kind of ignore the cues that go against guilt, and we focus on the cues that go towards guilt, and then we say this is the person. And we actually can find in research with false confessions, for example, that the more pressure you put on someone, you actually may get them to confess just to get out of the situation, because they figure, well, I didn't actually do it, and the justice system is going to help me out. But the problem is that if I was to poll 100 random people to say, would you ever confess to a crime you didn't commit? Every single one of them would say, I would never confess to a crime I didn't commit, right? And if you heard someone confess to a crime, what would you think? Well, they must have done it. And if they recant later, what do you think? Well, they're just trying to get out of it, get out of their punishment. They're guilty people. But the problem is that a lot, those same 100 people, if they were put under the pressure of the read technique, they may confess to get out of that situation, because it's a situation you've never been in before. It's psychologically kind of punishing, but it meets the gray area of not, you're not allowed to whip anyone or anything like that, but it meets this gray area where, oh, well, I was just asking them questions.
I guess the pushback from Reed would be, you have this research, it's done in, laboratory settings. What I've read is that they will often say, this isn't real life. We do this practically. We've trained thousands and thousands of police officers who have found success with using the technique. So, they kind of push the laboratory studies out of the way. How would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, laboratory studies, they don't have this, they've got internal validity, right? So it works in the lab and we can replicate it in the lab. Will it work out in real life? But the problem is that when we're testing these methods, there's something called signal detection theory, where you don't want to just look for the correct, oh, I got this correct. You want to look for the misses and the correct, looking for someone who didn't do it. And a lot of the research that they're showing is with actual guilty people. And if it's only 80% accurate with guilty people, that's really not great numbers. You'd want it 100% accurate, because now 20% of guilty people are getting away. but we need the other research. We need the research on innocent people. How many innocent people are they saying are guilty? What's that number? And then you have to combine those together, right? Or at least state them together. So, it catches 80% of guilty people. Cool. Does it catch 0% of innocent people? Because then I'd be like, it is actually 80% accurate. But if it's catching 80% of guilty people and 65% of innocent people, and by catching I mean identifying as guilty, well, that's got a lot of error in it. That's a bad test to use.
One of the more popular methods now is the peace method, where just trying to get the suspect to speak as much as possible and provide as much information as possible. And this was a model that was developed in the UK. And I have spoken to some senior police officers who were trained in Reed and now have been trained in the peace model. And their pushback is that in the UK, there's legislation that if someone is silent, that can be used against them in court, where in Canada, that is not the case. You're right to be presumed innocent and you're allowed to be silent. So a lot of them will say, yeah, we get the research, we get peace, but if you have a suspect that's giving us the middle finger and not talking to us, Reed still allows us to have that challenge or accusatory phase, right? And they say they'll never do that unless there's evidence and that they believe that this person is deceptive or likely to be guilty. Do you buy that argument, or do you have any comments about that?
Well, I mean, just saying, the words that you just said, we would never use that accusatory way unless we had evidence or they looked guilty. Well, the evidence that they have is that they think that they're guilty because of their body language, but that actually is nervousness. So what I find when you use the peace technique, you kind of start off with a little bit of rapport building, get to know them a little bit, put them a little bit more at ease. Again, because if we do that with an innocent person, they actually will be put at ease and they're less nervous, so they have less deceptive cues. And with a guilty person, probably is not going to put them at ease because they're still guilty. And the trick with the peace technique is that you allow them to talk as much as you want. Same with the cognitive interview. We're supposed to let the witnesses talk 70, 80% of the time. And we only talk about 20% of the time because we don't want to interrupt them. We don't want, as an authority figure, make them think that, oh, what I'm saying is wrong or I need to modify it. Okay. You want to direct them a little bit if they're getting off topic. But the neat thing with the peace technique is that the focus isn't on trying to figure out if this person is guilty or not. The focus is on the truth. So there's actually elements worked into the peace model where you're looking to see if, obviously we're looking to see if they say anything that makes them look guilty, but we also are looking for things that make them seem that they might be innocent. So we want to get information from them that goes along with the prosecution's case, but also would potentially negate the prosecution's case. And the fact that that instruction is right in the peace model, kind of, before you even go in, if you've been trained with this, then you've got this little tiny sliver of a doubt where this guy might be innocent, and you're looking for that. You're looking for the truth. And the neat thing about the peace model, because you allow them to talk. Well, what if they're lying? Well, if you've gone in at the proper moment to do this, cognitive interview with a suspect, if you've got your whole prosecution case kind of built up, you've got some pieces missing, but you allow them to talk, and they're just digging themselves a hole, because if they are lying, it's going to go against the original prosecution case and all the witnesses that you've got before. And now you've got something more to investigate, right? And then you can pull them back in after you finish that investigation again. You can pull them back in and you can have a little bit more of an accusatory peace model at that point, saying, look, well, here's the evidence we just found. You said this in our original interview and we found that you lied. Why would you lie? That kind of thing. Versus the Reed technique, where they kind of put forth two scenarios for you with no chance of saying that you're not guilty. And the one scenario is, well, you did it because you're a monster. Or the other scenario is you did it because of these pieces of evidence. And basically, whichever one you choose, it still says you're guilty. There's no option for saying not guilty. In fact, in the Reed technique interrogation manual, it says if they say no, cut them off right away. Never let them say no. The more they say no, the more that they're, going to keep trying to say no. And, then you won't be able to get them to say that they're guilty.
So what about what would you say to the critique, though, that, okay, you have a hardened criminal, let's say someone from a gang who's been around the block, multiple police encounters, they come in and they just say, lawyer, don't say anything. They're just sitting there in silence. If a suspect isn't going to talk, is peace still effective?
I would say, I mean, the whole point of police procedures is to gather evidence, right? We don't necessarily need a confession. We don't need a confession to convict someone if the evidence is solid enough when you go to trial that the picture comes together that this person must have done it. It's a suspect's right to not talk. I actually, I tell my students, A, don't commit crimes. But B, if you are in that situation, definitely have a lawyer with you and don't talk unless let your lawyer talk for you, because that anything you say can be used against you, right? And sometimes even your tone and your demeanor. So they said that they didn't do it, but it looked like they were guilty, and that's admissible in a court trial, right? So probably is good for people to not talk. And I mean,
Right.
yeah, we will get some hardened criminals that we won't be able to get to confess because we're not using the read technique, but it may save a lot of innocent people that in that situation are put under that huge amount of stress and they confess to get out of it.
And if they're that hardened, I'm not saying the read technique would work. They might just continue to tell the police to go pound sand. But I have heard that critique with respect to peace. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on it. But going back to the nonverbal cues, so Reed does look at these behaviorisms. When you look at our court system, as I said earlier, the judge will instruct a jury that they can assess demeanor of a witness during their testimony. And for example, it's still in a 2020 popular legal textbook that lots of law schools and law students use. It says that it's been observed directly by the trier of fact, and the trier of fact is entitled to use those observations when assessing witness testimony. And the problem is that, or a potential problem as I see it, is because of our jury secrecy laws, we don't know how much weight jurors are putting on nonverbal cues. So even though a judge may say, yes, you can consider that, but you have to consider a list of other things like matching it with other testimony and the physical evidence, et cetera, we don't know what they're actually assessing and when they sit down to do their deliberations. And based on the research where we can't really differentiate between nonverbal cues and nervousness, do you ever see us when I say us, I mean our court system getting to the point where we say, okay, we're not going to leave that on the table for jurors to assess. We're going to say, no, don't assess their demeanor or nonverbal cues. Focus on the actual evidence in the trial. Can you see us getting to that day at some point?
That would probably be ideal, and I think we'd have to have, so not only not allowing it, but actually having an instruction that says you're not supposed to use it. There's kind of that thought that don't jurors will disregard that information. That's usually a boomerang effect, right? Where I'm not supposed to look at that, and then they pay more attention to it. But again, if there's either a really good instruction by a judge or an expert witness that comes in and tells someone why they're not supposed to do that, people are actually quite good and willing and able to follow those instructions when they have a reason why. Humans really love reasons why, right? So, side example, like smoking outside of a school or something like that, you've got to be 9 meters away, and you just see people smoking because there might be a sign that says $500 fine. It's a punishment. People just do it because you're never punished for it. And if someone came up to them and said, "Hey, don't do that. You're going to be punished," they might walk off if it was a police officer. But if it was just a regular person, they just tell them off. But if someone walked up to them and gave them a reason why, like, "Oh, you're not supposed to smoke here because that's an intake and it goes right into a children's nursery," or something like that, they'd be, "Oh, I better not do that." Same thing with the justice system. If we tell the jurors, don't look at demeanor, and this is why, because it's very prejudicial, then I think they'd be better off, and I think they'd be able to do it. But I think that we need to get to a point where we do that, because we want to make sure that the justice system is balanced fairly. A lot of times the public gets outraged when we're treating criminals fairly, but at the same time they're not really potentially criminals. They're innocent until proven guilty. And we want to make sure to have as fair a court trial as possible so that this person has been put into prison or given a sentence based on the fact that they're actually guilty. And we want that guilt to be based on the evidence. And the problem is that even though I'm an optimist, I hope that the justice system is balanced fairly. I'm also a scientist who uses critical thinking and scientific method, and I know that people are biased. And I know as well, one of the biggest biases out there is the blind spot bias, where we think that we're not biased, right? We all think that we're average or better, and we're not. So, when people are attempting to be unbiased, that's probably, at least good, but sometimes we don't even know when we're supposed to attempt to be unbiased. I actually ran, this is a random experiment that I ran that it wasn't even related to what I was focused on. It was a neat result that I don't think I even reported, but I had a weird control condition where I was looking at the race of the defendant, so black versus white. And I had a weird control condition in it where I just didn't show the race at all and didn't mention the race. So it was instead of a picture of the person's face, it was just blank. It just described the defendant, said their name. The name was kind of race neutral. And I found that the verdicts were completely different from the white defendant and the black defendant. There was way less non-guilty verdicts. So just seeing someone is enough to, oh, I don't have enough information. What information can I use? This person looks guilty or doesn't look guilty. And, demeanor also is based on, just like regular old demeanor, but then we can throw in all sorts of other stereotypes as well, where we're more negative about some groups in society than others. And now, where is that going to come in with that demeanor question? So, yeah, it would be nice if we didn't have that in court trials.
I want to stick with the bias idea here with jurors. And you mentioned the blind spot bias. And I know that there's a ton of research out there, usually related to American juries, just because of our secrecy laws. It's tough to know deliberations and what biases and what factors we're considering. But in terms of, some of the common jury biases that might impact deliberations or their assessment of a case, can we just maybe review some of the more common ones that we think are probably present?
Yeah, for sure. So there's kind of four overarching ones: specific, interest, normative, and generic biases. And then we could also get into a couple different ones as well. But so if you actually know anyone in the case itself, that's probably a bad idea. If you've got some kind of actual interest in the outcome, the most common ones though would be the generic biases. So racism or sexism or homophobia, where this can really get into these trials. Another big one, actually, one of the best things a defendant could have in their favor is attractiveness. More attractive defendants are found guilty less often, unless, of course, the crime had to do with attractiveness. So people who are attractive, who swindle others, they're found guilty more often. But thieves, murderers, assault, if you're good looking, you're probably going to be, found guilty less often. Might only be a small fraction, but that's still a bias that shouldn't be used, right? And we also get into kind of our own, like, who are we as jurors, where that can affect so if the defendant is anything like you and there's not very much evidence, you'll have a kind of a polarized, they couldn't possibly have done it, and really fight about it. If the evidence is really, really strong and that defendant is like you, you're probably gonna throw them under the bus even more because it makes your group look bad. So there's all sorts of these biases. And it's our upbringing, right? We were raised in certain ways to see how the world works, and we kind of have an interest in kind of a just society. So we want to think that good people do good things and bad people do bad things. And when we get in front of a defendant, we already have this assumption that they're guilty because they're up for this trial. And we've got to, as best we can, remove that bias, whatever it is, and focus just on the evidence at hand.
From my reading, Will, I've read about this narrative fallacy. I'm sure it could go by a couple different names, but as human beings, we like stories that kind of fit a picture or make sense sequentially to us. Can you just discuss that, how that might impact jurors?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of research on that as well, where you can change style. So let's just say the evidence is equally good, equally strong, and we do it in kind of a mathematical model. So like, here's this piece of evidence. It shows, X, Y, Z, that reasons why they're guilty. Here's this next piece. Here's this next piece. And if the other side, so let's say the prosecution uses more of an evidence mathematical based model, and the defense has a equally strong case, but they use a story model, a narrative, they'll win every time. And if you flip that, the prosecution will win. Or if you've got both of them using story model, or both of them using kind of more of a mathematical model, it depends on which side has the stronger evidence. So we love stories, we love everything kind of fitting together. And when we've got a case that doesn't necessarily have enough evidence, but there's some. And there's an eyewitness or potentially a false confession that doesn't fit in with that story. That should make us say, okay, well, it's beyond, it's a shadow of a doubt. I should say not guilty. But a lot of the times, what we do instead is we use that confession that we're not supposed to use, or we use demeanor because if we say, oh, they're probably lying, well, now it fits with the rest of the evidence, right? And we want that story to go together. What a really good defense lawyer would do is say, hey, it doesn't fit with the story. That here's all the evidence that they've got, and it doesn't go along with this. And they really need to push that. Humans love things to make sense, and they like to be able to predict outcomes. And when we can't, it makes us feel awkward. We don't like that. And again, as well, just going back to, if there's a victim in this crime, we want someone to be punished for that, because if no one's punished, then we're not safe because that person's still out there. So a lot of people feel, and I've heard this kind of anecdotally with, in the Innocence Project, someone's found guilty, they're in prison. There's enough evidence to show after the fact, 20 years later, they absolutely didn't do it. And then you go back to the victim's family and they're like, we're happy. We know that this is the person who did it. We're happy they're in there, and we feel safe because he's behind bars. But this is, there's clear evidence that this person didn't actually do it. So the person they're scared of is still out.
And there's this idea, I think, too, at least what I've read about, and you indicated this earlier in our discussion, that we often will look for familiar information and these heuristics where you substitute that easy question for a harder question. So instead of, is this person guilty or did they commit this crime, you might think, is this person a nice person? Could you just discuss that with us? Is that a frequent thing?
Yeah, for sure. So again, that goes back to the kind of the demeanor element. It's like, okay, well, I've got to figure out if my job as a trier of fact is to figure out if this person is guilty or innocent. And here's the evidence I've got, and it's not enough. I don't know. Like when it's clear cut, we can ignore demeanor. That's easy. When it's so clear cut, they're very obviously innocent or very obviously guilty. But a lot of cases aren't like that, right? Especially when there's two sides arguing the same information in different ways. So what we may end up doing is relying on these heuristics that have helped us out before in the past. And a lot of times, it makes us feel good to help out good people, and it makes us, feel bad when we don't. We're social people. So we get into the situation where we're trying to make this decision. It's like, well, I don't know if this guy did it or not, but from the character information about him or the demeanor, is this someone who could do it? And then we make decisions on that. And that's really bad, because sometimes innocent people who are accused of crimes are criminals that, it's like, well, this person was a criminal and we know that they were in the area. So we picked them up and we interviewed them, and, there was enough indication to say that. So now they're in trial and they were totally innocent. Some famous cases, the Ronald Cotton case, he was accused of a sexual assault, and he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Doesn't even look like the guy who actually did it, where it was found later. I think it was with DNA evidence and possibly a confession from the actual culprit. But again, at trial, the witness was 100% confident this is the guy who did it. And even though we're not allowed to talk about, previous criminal background, this person maybe looks like a criminal, or there's some talk in the news that they were a criminal, and now, it's good enough. I think they're guilty. And that it shouldn't be guilty good enough. It's got to be beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Going back to piecing this narrative together as well, that we all do, this idea of, from Daniel Kahneman, of what you see is all there is. I always like that, because we all do this, where we see half of a headline in the news, and then we go and talk with our colleagues or friends like we're experts on this matter, and we've built this narrative and thing. How common is that?
I think it's really common. You get an idea that seems right to you, and then you get a couple pieces without actually doing any real research on it. You get a couple pieces that you've heard snippets of, and that's good enough. Like, oh, these people back me up. So then you go and piece this thing together with what makes the most sense. And now you strongly believe that without actually doing it. And we have this element, one of the biggest biases that we have, heuristics that we have, is the confirmation bias. So in scientific research and in critical thinking, we want to look for evidence that we're right, okay? And that's usually where people stop. But we really, just as importantly, or maybe even more importantly, we have to look for evidence that we're wrong. And we don't like doing that because we don't want to be wrong. But what we need to do is look for all the evidence and go, okay, well, in this pile, there's tons of evidence. And in this pile, there's really no evidence. And regardless of what your previous thoughts on it were, you should pick the pile with tons and tons of evidence. But what we do is, we derogate the source. So, well, that person who said that was they're stupid, or they're on the opposite political spectrum that I am. So you cling to this little tiny bit of evidence, and it's called belief perseverance. Even in the face of evidence that shows that you're wrong, you stick your guns with this stuff that you think is right, because it's not just a belief. There's actually an evaluative component to it, and if it makes up kind of who you are as well. You don't want to be wrong, because then that takes away that piece of your identity almost. So when you kind of already have certain beliefs, so liberal versus conservative versus NDP in Canada, you kind of have certain elements that you believe already, and then you pick sides. And it's really unfortunate that we pick sides and we don't kind of come together and look for the truth, because looking for the truth is usually going to be a lot more productive. Because if you use reality and the truth in actually planning your day, it's going to work out for you. If you use something that's not the truth, it's probably going to blow up in your face at some point.
So I want to talk now just briefly about juror comprehension. And so we know that these biases are just from the fact of being human. A lot of us have these biases, blind spot bias, where we, even though we think we don't have them, we do. And there's lots of research out there that suggests that jurors struggle with comprehension of complex legal instructions and just even standards of proof, for example, like beyond a reasonable doubt, et cetera. There's tons of research, and again, in the American context, because of our jury secrecy laws here, that suggests that jurors don't have a firm grasp on some basic legal principles. And given these potential biases, I want to get your comments or thoughts on whether Canada should be revisiting these jury secrecy laws. Do you think we need to maybe modify them, or at least have the ability, even anonymously, to look at what juries are deliberating?
Yeah, I think that would give us a lot of, say if we did it anonymously, we could see what elements are in play. We could actually do some research, some analysis of these deliberation process to see what common things come up. Because if we find commonly that people don't understand, the legal rules, well, then we could just implement. Let's give them some simple instructions. We don't have to give them the actual laws. We could give them what the law means. Compared to a judge who's a legal expert who's been trained for years, jurors, I'd have to look at the more recent research, but last time I saw it, on average, they're in their 40s and they've got a high school education. That may be a little higher education now in Canada, but they might not understand that they're not legal experts. So they kind of depend on the judge and the lawyers to describe that to them, and maybe it doesn't work, maybe it does. So looking into jury deliberation would probably be a good idea. I think the reason we've kind of got this as anonymous and secret is so we don't say, oh well, this juror wanted them to be guilty and this juror, because we have to have unanimous verdicts in Canada, and we want to kind of know that, well, behind the scenes it was all fair and all legal and it was perfect, but it's probably not perfect. So why not do some analysis, get some researchers in to analyze the next year's worth of jury deliberations and find some common problems, and then we could actually try to solve them. And if we don't, then they're just going to continue on, and we can't just be blind and say, well, maybe there's just no problems in there. We at least should look to see if there are or not.
Do you think maybe some of the reluctance is we just don't want to know?
Yeah, I would guess so, because we want to be confident that the judicial system works, that guilty people go to prison, innocent people don't go to prison, and we want to that makes us happy, right? We want to make sure that the stuff works that's supposed to work. And the thing is that by ignoring it, that doesn't make it any better, right? By actually looking at it and going, okay, this doesn't work, let's try to fix it. Now that's a much better coping strategy for that. It's much more adaptive, because then we actually can make it work the way we want it. If we want it to work properly, then we should try to make it work properly. We shouldn't just ignore the problem.
That makes sense. So something to consider if any policymakers are listening to this.
Yes.
Can only hope. So Will, I am mindful of your time now. You do have another appointment coming up. So I just want to talk generally about where you have social media, where can people follow you, and any websites, that sort of stuff.
Well, I'm got Twitter, Instagram, I think. I don't check them as often. If you did want to contact me, you could give them my email. It's will.huggon@utoronto.ca. And yeah, I do frequent social media. I probably shouldn't look at the comment sections as much as I do. It's disheartening as a psychologist, forensic psychologist. But yeah, if people want to contact me, they can email me.
It's great, Will. We really appreciate your time again. And there's stuff I would love to continue to talk about. So down the road, love to have another conversation. Yeah.
I would love to. Yeah, yeah. Contact me anytime, and all right, good luck with the rest of your interviews.